Hey y'all, thanks for stopping by today. Today we're going to discuss a topic that a lot of people really don't understand, and that's recoil springs and how they work with different firearms. Make sure you check out the links down below in the description from great companies and great savings like Olight, OneLeaf.ai for night vision, as well as our Amazon store. And hey, I really appreciate you guys for watching, and make sure you support us on Patreon as well. So let's jump into recoil springs. What is a recoil spring? So a recoil spring is just this. Hold it up here so you guys can see it. Spring. This is a recoil spring. Now this one that I have in my hand is for a Glock, and this is called a flat wound spring. So if you can see here, see if I can get it to zoom in. So there's a couple of different types of springs. There's a flat wound spring and a round spring. Flat means that the coils themselves are flat versus a traditional spring, which the coils themselves are round. And different springs work with different firearms, different guide rod assemblies and everything. But the big question is, what does a recoil spring do? So what does a recoil spring do? A recoil spring does a few different things. One, the recoil spring provides spring tension to allow the slide to cycle to the rear, back to the front, and strip the round off the magazine. And two, the recoil spring keeps the slide in the barrel locked up in battery until the round is fired and the round exits the muzzle. That's essentially it. But there's a few different things with different firearms that require a heavier or potentially a lighter recoil spring. And that's what we're going to jump into today. What recoil spring will work the best for your particular firearm, and help you to answer the question, if I'm ordering new recoil springs or a recoil spring assembly or a guide rod assembly, especially if it's one of the captured type assemblies like this, what type of assembly and what spring weight do I need to order for my particular pistol for it to function at its optimal best, for me to get the best performance out of it? So let's talk about some different types of firearms. You have hammer-fired firearms like your 1911, you have striker-fired firearms like your Glocks, and then you have a different striker-fired type firearm like your Smith & Wesson M&Ps or your IWI Masadas. And the way the assemblies work internally on those striker-fired pistols can be very different from one type striker assembly to another type striker assembly. So first, let's talk about hammer-fired, which are going to be like your 1911s, your CZ75s, and so on and so forth. Let's talk about those first, and then we'll move into the striker-fired pistols. So your hammer-fired pistols, like your 1911s, make sure you guys can see it well, like this, has a hammer on the rear, and then the recoil spring, which works with the slide. A hammer-fired pistol, the recoil spring, which goes under the barrel in this area right here, either on top of a guide rod or a two-piece recoil assembly, depending on the type of firearm, really has two purposes. One purpose is to keep the slide locked up in battery until the round exits the muzzle. And the second thing the recoil spring has to do is have enough energy when the slide cycles to the rear to strip a round off the top of the magazine and lock the slide in battery and keep it in battery. So with 1911s, especially for say like 9mm, which is extremely popular in almost all type firearms today, the 9mm cartridge does not require a very heavy recoil spring for 1911s. It only requires a heavy enough recoil spring to keep the pistol in battery and enough spring weight to be able to strip the first round off of a loaded magazine. As the spring in the magazine moves rounds up, as you fire the rounds out of the magazine, you have a decreased spring tension in the magazine, which takes less force to strip the round off the magazine. So really the first 3 or 4 rounds out of the magazine require the most recoil spring tension to be able to strip the rounds. Once you get past the first 3 or 4 rounds, the recoil spring weight can actually go down to still be able to reliably strip the rounds off the magazine, chamber them, and fully close the slide. So on a 1911 type pistol or a CZ75, we're really only focusing on the first 3 or 4 rounds out of the magazine for the weight of the recoil spring to reliably strip those rounds, chamber them, and fully close the slide for the rounds to fire. Now, for different calibers, it's going to require a different spring rate. For most of your, and we'll talk about first, the full-size government model, 5-inch barreled, full recoil system, 1911, or CZ75 with your full-length slide. 9mm is going to require between an 8 and a 9-pound recoil spring to reliably strip the round off of the magazine, close the slide, fully chamber the round, and allow the round to fire. Complete the extraction process, ejection process, chamber the next round, fully close the slide, and be able to fire the next round. 8 pounds to 9 pounds is all you need for a 9mm. Now, me personally, I like to run what's called a shock buff. And a shock buff is either a urethane or an aluminum buffer that goes in between the guide rod head and the recoil spring. And what that does is it helps to deaden the blow of the slide when it moves to the rear, and helps to reduce recoil and muzzle flip by deadening that impact of the slide when the slide reaches its full stroke to the rear. It's like hitting a hammer on top of a vise. The hammer is going to bounce every single time, right? A steel hammer. Well, if you use what's called a dead blow hammer, you hit at the top of a vise with a dead blow hammer, and boom, the hammer just stops. Well, the shock buff creates that dead blow hammer type impact on your slide. So it comes to the rear, it just stops, and then it moves back forward. You don't get that bounce with it, which really helps to reduce muzzle rise, felt recoil in your hand, and it helps you to track the sight on the firearm a lot better. 9mm, government model 1911, 8 to 9 pounds is really all that you need as far as a recoil spring. And that's 1911 or 2011. So your wide body guns that hold 20 to 25 rounds, 8 to 9 pound spring is all you need for those to be able to function reliably. And your CZ75s are the same way. CZ75, full-size pistol that guys use for competition and carry, defensive use, whatever. With those full-size CZ75s, 8 pounds to 9 pounds is all you need to be able to strip the rounds off the magazine, close the slide reliably, keep the slide locked up until the round exits the muzzle, and then you get a very accurate, reliable pistol with a very soft recoil spring in the pistol, which does not have a lot of muzzle flip or a lot of muzzle dip when the slide closes. Now, when you step down on your 1911s or your 2011 with the commander length slide, 4.25 inches, right around, anywhere from 4 to 4.25 inches on the barrel length, it has a shorter recoil system. With the commander length pistols, you have to have a heavier recoil spring, even in 9mm, for those pistols to function properly. With those pistols, I generally recommend a 9mm, a 14, 15, 16 pound recoil spring, depending on the pistol, to be able to reliably cycle, strip the round off the magazine, and close the slide completely to be able to fire and hold everything in battery. Which sounds like a lot of difference, but you have to remember you're shorter on your barrel length by 3/4 inch. You're shorter on your recoil assembly by 3/4 inch. You're shorter on the stroke of the slide, which makes the biggest impact by 3/4 inch. So when you shorten everything down, everything gets smaller. You have to go with a heavier recoil spring assembly in those firearms for the pistol to function properly. So government model 5-inch guns or 6-inch, 8 to 9 pound spring, all you need. Commander length guns, you have to go heavier, 14, 15, 16 pound spring for reliability. And I always recommend buy a 3-pack. Get a 14 pound, 15 pound, and 16 pound spring and see which one works the most reliably in your particular pistol. Some guns will work with a lighter spring. Some guns you have to go with a heavier spring to get it to run reliably. It varies from pistol to pistol. Now that we've covered some of our hammer-fired pistols, let's move into striker-fired pistols, which are a little different animal. So today we're going to talk about the IWI Masada. Hold it up here where you guys can get a good look at it. The IWI Masada and the Smith & Wesson M&P both have a very similar striker system in their pistol. They're designed with a pivoting sear in the pistol, so the sear starts up like this, you pull the trigger and it just rocks the sear down. It doesn't really cock the striker or move the striker any further to the rear for the pistol to fire. The Masada style pistols and also the Smith & Wesson M&Ps, those firearms will allow you to run a lighter recoil spring than different pistols, say like your Glocks. With the Masadas, with the M&Ps, normally I start with, in 9mm, I'll start with a 16-pound spring and go down to a 15, go down to a 14, go down to a 13, and keep trying lighter springs until I find the spring rate that works the best with that particular pistol. Now what I'm looking for with my striker fired pistol is accuracy. I'll load 10 rounds in the magazine, I'll put a 16-pound spring in the pistol, and I'll shoot a 10-round group at 15 to 20 yards, and you're really just focusing on your group. The group should be offhand, depending on your ability, 2 inches or so at 15 or 20 yards. If you're getting a 2-inch or so group at 15 or 20 yards, drop your recoil spring by a pound. Go down to your 15. Try the same thing. You should still see the same size group. If you do, go down to a 14, then a 13, then a 12, then an 11, until you see the groups start opening up. And you'll see it. It'll go from, say, a 2-inch group to all of a sudden you just shot a 6-inch group. And you're like, well, I saw the sights. Everything looked great. What's happening is the gun is actually starting to unlock before the round has exited the muzzle. So the barrel starts to tilt down with the tilt barrel systems that they have, and when the barrel moves, that causes a point of impact shift, and it's not consistent and it's not repeatable. So with your pistols like your Smith & Wesson M&P, your IWI Masadas, some of the others that are out there that have the pivoting style sear system for the striker, play with your recoil springs until you start seeing a degradation in accuracy. And at that point, say you hit the 13-pound mark, your groups open up, go up a pound with your recoil spring to a 14-pound spring. That way your groups stay nice and tight, and you've minimized the recoil spring weight that you need for that particular pistol to still be able to get the best possible accuracy that you can achieve out of that firearm. Now we're going to move into the Glocks. And Glocks are a different animal than a lot of your other firearms. With a Glock, the striker is pulled to the rear when you rack the slide, but it's not all the way to the rear. One of the big problems that you have with a Glock is that last little bit of trigger pull. It actually pulls the striker further to the rear before it releases it and drops it, and the firearm fires and goes through its firing cycle. With a Glock, that last little bit that you move pulling the trigger to the rear is actually pulling the striker to the rear, but it's also pulling the slide and the recoil spring assembly to the rear. And one of the biggest issues that I see with a Glock, and we'll talk about the Glock 19 today because that is probably one of the most popular Glocks that's out there for defensive use, for carry, concealment, even competition. The Glock 19 is extremely popular. Lots of people have them. There's a ton of clones out there with your P80s, with your PSA daggers, and there's recoil springs available from 11 pounds all the way up to 20 plus pounds. And I know a lot of you out there are asking, what is the right recoil spring for my Glock 19? Well, first off, you've got your captured recoil spring assembly like this, which is what the majority of us use, are captured assemblies. So you say, well, what recoil spring should I order with my Glock 19 to work best with my pistol? And, once again, we're talking about 9mm on your Glocks. All right, 9mm Glock 19, captured recoil spring assembly. What's going to work best with that pistol? And, then a lot of guys, hey, you say, I want to throw a comp on there. I want to run a comp on it. Will my pistol run with this comp? Will my pistol run with that comp? And this recoil spring assembly? The answer to your question is the recoil spring that you run in your Glock 19 has to have enough spring weight to to hold the slide closed after you rack it, strip the round off the magazine, but also when you pull the trigger. And that's the big thing. On a Glock, when the spring is too light, when you pull the trigger, it will actually pull the slide to the rear like this. And it will unlock the slide, pull the slide slightly out of battery, and you'll get a light primer strike. The pistol won't go off, and you're like, what's wrong with my gun? Why didn't my gun go off? You rack the slide, another round in the chamber, pull it, pull the trigger, it fires fine. Pull the trigger the next time, maybe it goes off, maybe it doesn't. And you're like, I don't know what's wrong with my gun. Maybe I need a heavier striker spring, which is the exact opposite of what you need, because a heavier striker spring requires even more force to release the striker from the cruciform on the trigger bar and pulls it out of battery even further, so you get even more light primer strikes. There's a balance with the Glock 19s. And what we found is on the majority of your Glock 19s, a 17-pound recoil spring is what is required for that pistol to function reliably 100% of the time. There's a lot of companies that sell 15-pound springs, 13-pound springs, even 11-pound springs for the Glock 19. And in some instances, those recoil springs will work on that firearm for a short period of time, but they won't work reliably over an extended period of time. What happens is you'll pull the trigger, the slide will slightly unlock, the barrel will drop down, and you'll get a light primer strike. So with the Glock 19, I only recommend a 17-pound recoil spring for reliability. So now you're asking, well, I've got a comp on my pistol, I've got a muzzle brake on my pistol, I've got, whatever different companies are calling it. They all do the same thing. They're all designed to redirect gas to help reduce muzzle flip. Well, with a compensator that vents gas upward, all right, the gas comes out of the comp, it goes up. So when gas goes up out of your comp, what does that do? It drives the muzzle down, which drives the upper lug on your barrel up to keep the pistol locked up and in battery longer. When you drive this lug up, you need to have a lighter recoil spring for the pistol to cycle properly. All depending on how many chambers you have in your comp, how the comp is designed, how it drives the gas. But on most of your comps that are out there, drive the muzzle of the barrel down, drive the chamber of the pistol up to increase lockup time or dwell time with the pistol. They can cause cycling issues with your Glock. And the only way to overcome that is to go with a lighter recoil spring. Well, once you start going with lighter springs, like a 15-pound or a 13-pound or even an 11-pound spring, then you run into the issue that the pistol will not completely chamber the round. It'll stop out of battery this far back. That's all that it takes. That last little bit right there. If you can see, that last little bit, that's all that it takes for a Glock to be out of battery and not fire. You'll get a light primer strike, the pistol won't function properly, and you end up racking the round out, trying another round, and it's just a nightmare anytime you're at the range. With your Glocks, make sure that you test it with different springs and make sure that it will run reliably with the recoil spring weight that you decide to use in it. If you're running a comp and it won't run with a 17-pound spring, but it will run with a 15-pound spring, make sure you test that firearm with several hundred rounds before you decide to carry it. Because the worst thing you could do with a carry firearm is pull it out when you need it and it fires one round and then jams because it won't fully cycle the slide. I'd much rather have a little more recoil with a pistol that is reliable than a flat shooting pistol that is unreliable. And the only way you're going to know is to test it with your firearm and be able to determine what spring weight and spring rate works with your particular firearm. Older Glocks that have a lot of rounds through them, so you've got 10,000, 15,000 rounds through a Gen 3 Glock 19. That particular pistol may work with a 15-pound spring or maybe even a 13-pound spring. But your new pistol, you go out, you buy a new pistol, you get a new barrel, you get a new comp, you get a new recoil spring assembly, and you put a 15-pound recoil spring assembly in it. I'm telling you, it's not going to run. It will not run. Now, there's going to be some of you out there that watch this video and you're like, well, I just did that with mine and it ran great. It may for a little while, a short period of time, but then you're going to get light primer strikes. I've seen it over and over and over again. These pistols, the Glock 19s, do not like really lightweight recoil springs because you're overcoming a lot of different springs with that pistol as you pull the trigger. All right. You've got a striker spring in your pistol that is, we'll call it the stock spring is 6 pounds. Striker spring is 6 pounds. The weight of the slide and then the recoil spring is 11 pounds, right? Well, as you pull that trigger, if you exceed that 11-pound mark, you're going to unlock the slide, pulling it to the rear. And that could be a variety of different factors. The angle of the connector, the angle of the trigger bar, how if your striker assembly is binding slightly inside the channel liner, the little plastic piece that goes in the slide. Any kind of rubbing in there, any kind of binding that you have is all going to impact the type of recoil spring assembly that you can use in that pistol. When you start to play with recoil springs with your Glock, start heavy, work your way down a pound at a time until you have cycling issues, and then go back up at least a pound on your recoil spring assembly. And you'll have a very reliable, very accurate pistol. Understand that multi-chamber comps on Glock 19s or heavy comps that are made out of stainless steel or carbon steel and add a lot of weight to the front of the barrel can have an adverse effect in the cycling and reliability of that particular pistol. Now, with that being said, with your Glock, you still want to have enough spring to strip the round off a fully loaded magazine. You want to be able to have enough spring weight to be able to close the slide reliably and keep the slide closed. Those are the two most important things. Strip the round off the magazine, keep the slide closed after it chambers around during the trigger pull process, and keep the slide closed during the firing process until after the round has exited the muzzle. Once the round has exited the muzzle, the recoil spring only has one job. It has to be able to move the slide to the rear and have enough energy to strip the next round off of the slide, close the slide completely, and keep it closed until you fire the next round. And with most firearms, there's a range that you need to stay within. 1911s and 9mm, 8 to 9 pounds. CZ pistols, full-size CZ pistols, 8 to 9 pounds. Smith & Wesson M&Ps, IWI Masada, 13 to 14 pounds. Glock 19s, you need to be in the 17-pound range, 16 to 17-pound range. With your Glock 17s, because it has a longer stroke on the slide, you can actually go with a lighter spring. The Glock 17s or Glock 34s, 11 to 13 pounds can work on those. If everything is optimized and polished and nothing is binding, you can get away with an 11 to 13 pound spring on a Glock 17 or a Glock 34. But everything has to be perfect. If it's not, the 15-pound spring is as light as you can go on a 17 or a 34. And then we have different types of recoil springs. I've only got a couple that I'm talking about today. Both of these are flat wound springs. The top is a captured. The bottom is just a loose captured spring. There's also round springs, and those are your uncaptured style springs. They work with 1911s, they work with Smith & Wesson M&Ps and Masadas, they work with your Glocks. It's a little different guide rod configuration that you use with the Masada and the M&P and the Glock, but that spring is not captured. So captured means it's got a screw on the end and a washer that holds everything on the guide rod itself. An uncaptured spring is the full length spring like this. The guide rod goes up through it and the spring has loose or free length at the end. You insert the free length into the end of the slide, compress everything in, and then put that on your pistol. Both work exceptionally well with different types of pistols. It's just a different styles. The captured is super easy to install. where the uncaptured spring can be a lot more difficult to install on your particular firearm. And with me personally, it depends on the type of firearm that I'm using for what type of spring that I'm using. 1911s with full-size government model or commander length slides, I use an uncaptured spring. If I go to an officer's size 1911, then I use a captured flat wound spring because it seems to work better. It has just a better overall feel with the pistol. IWI Masadas with my Smith & Wesson M&Ps, a lot of times I'll use an uncaptured spring with those versus the captured spring. It allows me to really be able to tune the pistol to a particular load, and I think you get a smoother feel with the pistol with an uncaptured spring on the Masadas and the M&Ps. Now with the Glocks, I only use captured springs with the Glocks. I've tried them with uncaptured springs, and they are, one, they're a nightmare to get their guide rod assembly into the pistol, and two, I haven't seen any benefit with an uncaptured versus a captured spring assembly on the Glocks. So with my Glocks, I always use a captured spring assembly and tune it to the weight that works the best for my particular pistol. Thanks for watching, y'all, and I really hope that this video helped you with understanding recoil springs and how they work with different firearms. Once again, make sure to check out the links down below in the description from some great companies and great savings from companies like Olight, OneLeaf.ai for all of your night vision needs, and also our Amazon store, which has some great savings and helps support our channel. And hey, if you're really wanting to help support us, our Patreon link is also down below, and we really appreciate all of the support that all of you give us from Patreon. That helps to keep us producing great content for YouTube, as well as some additional content that only our Patreon viewers get to view. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.